I don't even know how I first heard about the peace encampment. I know when I first came to the camp. So
That's cool.
how about I start there?
That's
So
cool.
the very first time I came to the camp was in the summer of '83. And I came for a long weekend. And it was not an important weekend. It was the weekend after, like it was July, the weekend after the big weekend. And so I was there for 4 days. And then the next time I came to the camp was in June of '85. And then I was there from June of '85 to September of '85. And then went back to Chicago for 4 months and then came back from January of '86 to September of '86.
And what had you been doing in Chicago?
So I went to divinity school in Chicago. And I went with Gary, who was my partner at the time. And the first time I came, I mean, I was pretty involved in peace issues and feminist spirituality and all of that. So I probably heard about the camp via those networks. And, you know, the first time I came, it was more about being a part of this wonderful peace action. I remember there was a lot of talk about the flags and the flag controversy that was happening, that had already happened but was still sort of carrying on in the filters of things. So it was just a little glimmer of the peace camp. I knew that it existed. Then I was in seminary, and then I was coming out as a lesbian in Chicago, and in the process of leaving my partner. And this was in December of '84. And so I finished that semester and I thought, what am I going to do with myself? And I thought, I want to go where the lesbians are and where the political lesbians are. And so I had very little money, so I think I had about $100 or maybe $150, and I bought a tent and I bought a bus ticket, and then maybe I had $50 left. And I got on the bus from Chicago to New York. Where did we come in? Geneva? That's where we came in?
Probably.
And
On the bus?
On the bus. And Woody Blue picked me up from the bus and drove me to the peace camp, and there I was for the summer.
What was your first impression of Woody Blue?
She's marvelous. She was so hospitable. I just felt welcomed in, you know, just brings you right in. And within the first couple of days, it might have been the first day, it might have been the second day, there was a lump. I don't know if other people have talked about lumps.
Oh, but please talk about it now.
Okay, but what did it stand for? Yeah. Anyway, it was just basically a big pile of lesbians all on top of each other, just cuddling and being silly. So I felt very at home.
Do you remember what your first impressions were when you first got to the peace camp the first time?
I mean, there was to me, like the marvelousness of the peace camp was that, okay, we're protesting this weapons base, but part of what we're doing is trying to create the world the way we want it to be and can imagine it to be. So it was a whole experiment in egalitarian community and women's community. And so there was a kind of, it was like you were entering a different country when you walked on the land, or when you even hung out with peace camp women. But that sense of, you know, coming onto the land, and I think, you know, the first time was short enough that it was more philosophical, you know, like, okay, we're trying to do things by consensus, we're trying to be connected to the earth, we're, you know, protesting nuclear weapons. I think when I came there the other times, like that piece of what it means to create alternative community was more interesting to me even than the nuclear weapons-based protests. I mean, I don't think I could have done that with a group that wasn't politically protesting, but, you know, how we managed to live together and deal with conflict and I mean, there's millions of stories, so it's, but that was, but that's the impression I carry away, was that we were creating a new world. Women were we said women instead of people, so I've reverted back to saying people because I'm in mixed communities now, but women were really skillful and talented. Like Woody was the carpenter, and I remember all the ramps that we had made, or that she had made. I didn't make them, but I remember the paintings on the barn and on the shed and on the shitters, and like there were paintings everywhere. What other first impressions? If you go onto the land enough, people did not wear clothes. It's amazing to me now that we have ticks with Lyme disease. How did you do that? But, or you wore practical clothes like your work boots, your jean shorts, and that was it. So there was those are some of my first impressions.
Do you remember anything about like the first affinity group that you worked with or did an action with?
It seems more fluid than that for me, because I came alone to the peace camp, so I remember affinity groups coming to the peace camp, but I don't remember being in one.
Do you remember any specific actions that you did?
See, here's the question. These actions that, like, will the FBI come hunting us down at this point? One of the actions I remember is when, and you were there, I feel like Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz, you were there, you were there, you were there. So, this was one of those nighttime actions to go cut the fence. And we went through the woods, and there were probably 10 of us. And we did some fence cutting, and then we're on the way back, and then these guys from the base, they must have been from the base, came on our land, and you just like played into them. What are you doing on our land? And what is this all about? And so so there was a whole. You were just marvelous the way you shouted at them and told them they had no right to come on our land, and so then that was...
They had no authority. I remember saying, you have no authority on this land. And I also remember, Myke, that you had the bolt cutters.
Well, I'm trying to think, did they go away and then come back?
No, one of the guys grabbed you, he had one hand, you gave me the bolt cutters, I threw them in the woods, and we were like tugging. There was this little tug of war. No, you're not getting her, come on. And
because what I remember is that there was another time when they came on the land with a warrant.
By the time we got
back, I was the one that they were looking for, yes. But the warrant said something like, somebody who's 5'2" and dark hair, and you made them say, well, what are you searching for? And you made them really give all those descriptions so that they couldn't just roam at large looking for somebody.
And I remember watching you in the circle, and you were just like growing, getting taller and taller.
Because I'm really 5'8", so.
And they wanted a dark-haired woman, and your hair, the sun was like, it had been raining, and it was like, it seemed to be getting redder and redder.
Anyway, needless to say, they did not find me. And I actually was never arrested at the peace camp, with all the various things that we did. It just didn't happen.
Why cut the fence?
Why cut the fence? Certain kinds of actions have a tradition, and I had actually been over to Greenham Common Peace Camp. What year would have that been? Earlier that year, in February of that year. And they had a tradition of cutting the fence at Greenham, and they actually would take it down. And so I think that it was a kind of symbolic direct action to say that we shouldn't be making these kinds of closed bases with weapons of mass destruction on them. So so women would do actions to go over the fence, to get onto the base. It was, and I had done that. I had done a trespass action earlier on in my life in Michigan, where I'd actually gotten arrested. And maybe the other piece of it is that at least those kinds of actions that were more direct and more civil disobedience, it's like one way you have of saying this isn't okay. The fence cutting was, classically if it was civil disobedience, I would have turned myself in. So we were doing a little bit more symbolic direct action. And some of it maybe is, looking back on it, is that sense of not letting them control us, being a little wild.
So what is some of the wildness that you remember?
Well, there was, I think it's the, what does it look like to create a new world? So some of it was good and some, maybe didn't turn out so well. I remember some endless consensus meetings. I remember the meeting about tobacco and what smokers should do and not, and being in a circle, and Michelle Crone being the facilitator, and this whole, it went on for hours in my memory. And it was this whole thing, and I remember you, you're being one of the smokers, saying, I'm not gonna, that's like a perfection thing, and I'm not gonna suddenly have to not have any faults, just because somebody else doesn't like it. And other people say, oh, these are bad chemicals, and we shouldn't be supporting the patriarchal institution of smoking, and then there was the whole thing of, well, tobacco's sacred, so we shouldn't be calling it a bad thing, which I had to bring up, and I don't remember what the conclusion was. Well, and we probably created some sort of compromise where the smokers would be, there was probably some, eventually, Michelle Crone, what I remember about that too is just how impressive a facilitator Michelle Crone was in terms of being able to hold all these people with all these divergent, value-laden opinions in one circle. But then there were the ones, that were a little more challenging and are hard to talk about without maligning certain individuals.
Well, can you say what issues they were about?
A woman coming on the land and not being willing to honor the guidelines about nudity in the front area of the property. The woman who moved her belongings into the attic and decided to live there. And I'm trying to think. Yeah, those were some of the big ones. And then I think the everyday issues of some women doing all the work and then other women not, like that, how do you have community together? I actually wrote an article about some of that stuff, comparing it to the Catholic worker movement, which I'd been a part of, where when you have a community that's based on consensus but has no boundaries so that anybody can come in and out, it's really a setup for people who could subvert the process. And so that was, I think, one of the lessons that I took away, is that if you're going to have an egalitarian consensus model of decision making, maybe there has to be some sense of who's in the circle before just anyone passing through for a weekend suddenly has the same authority as anybody else who's been there for months. And because I think there were times when we spent a month dealing with someone who didn't want to agree to the guidelines instead of doing other kinds of work. So it was useful as a learning experience, but I wouldn't want to carry it into some other community that I was a part of. So, what other things? I remember the Average Dyke Band.
Tell us about that.
In my memory, almost every single night after we'd done whatever work we were doing, we'd sit around the fire and play music. And there's a thing about music that you can be exhausted, but then if you start singing, you have energy again. And I think it was actually, I think Hershey, you were the spark that ignited that happening. But I know for me that was one of the most creative times musically for me, just to have all those people to share music with, and some of the things that we did sort of collaboratively, and so there was that was marvelous. And then of course we went and did the Women's Music Festival circuit, open mics, and we hit, let me see, we went to New England Women's Musical Retreat, we went to Michigan, there was one other one. And it's hard to even pick out a specific memory because we just did it every night.
Do you remember how the music came to be, like how the writing of the music happened?
Well, the Average Night Band had already started before I got there, but just barely. Like I think you guys had been jamming like a week or two maybe. It was kind of coalescing as people were coalescing that summer. So some of it, individual people would sort of bring a song and we'd all sing. Some of it, individual people would bring like a verse and a chorus, and then we'd write other verses. Like I actually do, I'm trying to think what the one was that was the most collaborative. I do have a written copy of the Seneca songs. I lost my tape.
Revolution?
Yeah, Revolution.
Talk.
Yeah, Revolution Talk was, and you wrote it, the music, I believe, or you and someone else.
Yeah, I can't remember.
Hershey is who I'm talking to, in case the camera cares, and then different ones of us added verses, and yeah.
Did you have a favorite song?
Probably Revolution Talk. I'd have to go back and look at the list. But then I also brought a couple of songs that I had written. So maybe I should tell the story of Every Woman Here.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah, and that song grew out of, at various times we'd have workshops, and we decided to have a writer's workshop, and there were maybe 8 or 10 of us who gathered in a circle and were doing writing exercises. And then as we were sharing those writing exercises, almost every story was about a woman's experience of sexual violence, or being raped, or being sexually abused as a child. So it was just like this, I mean, we were all crying out there sharing these stories. And so that just really stayed in my heart. It was just like overwhelming to me that so many women had experienced violence. And then there was another part of this song, and I'll have to go look at the song. I'm trying to think, was it your granddaughter?
Kai's sister.
Kai's sister.
Oh, Kai's sister, who came on and asked a question, and I'm going to have to go back to that part of the story. But
she wanted folks to lie to her.
Oh yes,
Tell her it's not
tell her
true.
that it's not true, that about what's happening with nuclear weapons,
Right.
and so that fear of a child of the violence in the world, and so all those things really gelled in my heart to write that song, and I can probably find it and share it later, too. So, and then there was, like there was experimenting in every fashion, and so there was also the who's sleeping with who tonight inspiration for music, and non-monogamy as it was called then, and I had just come out of a long, like a 6-year relationship, and so I wasn't sure that I wanted to be in a relationship, but I was also a brand new lesbian, and so I think I was actually in love with like everybody in a generic sort of way. It was just a wonderful, wonderful place to come out as a lesbian. And so that was an inspiration for music, among other things. I know I wrote one song about Gail Walker.
Oh, what?
Lonely Woman.
Ah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, she wasn't lonely towards me, though. But she kissed me once, and that was you know, right to the heart. Gail was in her other life, was a professor. And then at Peace Camp, she was just such a wise woman. She was part Cherokee, and she had her own interesting and convoluted love history there, because she originally came with Jane Eyre, right? And then Jane Eyre got involved with Merry Christmas, who I later got involved with, you know, like our little circles. And then I'm trying to think who Gail got involved with.
You mean who she didn't get?
Well, she didn't get involved with me, so that was, so yeah, so I know that she had a couple of lovers going at the time when she had when she kissed me, and, you know, it just was too much. She couldn't add anybody else. All right, help me with the name here. Who is the woman from California who I was digging the sweat lodge? Somehow we were making like a half cave, dug in sweat lodge. And then, because Gail came later, I don't think Gail was the one that was digging it with me.
I do remember when that was happening, but I can't remember which.
Lindsay.
Fire.
For whatever reason, we were digging out, you know, like into about 2 feet down all around. And so I think eventually we finished it, and then Gail was part of that sweat lodge. And my tent that year of '85 was also in the hedgerow further up, and your tent was in the same hedgerow with me. We had a little under the hawthorns. It was very sweet. And I should mention Laura Briggs, if we're talking about names, because I got involved with Laura Briggs on the blue moon, which was the second full moon in July that year. I look back now, she had turned 21. That seems so young. And I had turned 32. We met over being the workaholics. There were work meetings every morning, or some of us were pushing for that because there was that drift into doing nothing that would happen at the Peace Camp. And so she and I had bonded over, let's have work meetings so we know what's going on, because we're both, you know, let's get the work done. So then we got involved, and then we didn't go to the work meetings. Or at least for a couple of days. But I was greatly into non-monogamy that summer, so I also had some other interludes.
And was Laura with other women as well during that time?
She was. And she had a lover back home too. So, but we eventually became lovers in non-Peace Camp world after the summer of '86. We had just gotten involved before the Michigan trip, which was Laura, me, Estelle, and Hershey driving to Michigan, and we stopped in Ann Arbor to deface a billboard. Well, we probably stopped for another reason, but that was fun. And then our next stop was my mother's house, my parents' house. Were they hospitable? I think they were very hospitable, but I think afterwards my mother said, I'm uncomfortable you bringing all these lesbians home. I don't know if she would use the word lesbians, you know, those kind of women to my house or something. So yeah, they're still very hospitable, my parents, but they're still very conservative, more so if anything. But yeah, that was a challenge. We all stopped for lunch, and then we went on to the Michigan Festival. I think that's how we were getting there, in your little car that had a name.
Dragonfly.
I can't remember now.
How did the Peace Camp inform your spiritual practices?
When I was living in Grand Rapids, Michigan, I had left the Catholic Church and gotten involved in spirituality, women's spirituality, you know, spirituality that was about the liberation of women and about incarnating the goddess. So when I went to divinity school, I was going there as a kind of ex-Catholic feminist spirituality goddess person. And one of the things I actually did at Peace Camp is that when I was there in the winter of 86, I was actually doing some independent studies for the Peace Camp. So I wrote my own constructive theology, which was one of our required classes. But I wrote it as a ritual poem, and it was called Casting a New Circle. And a little bit about my journey out of Christianity and my journey into the goddess. So that whole being in goddess spirituality I had done before. I'd been part of women's spiritual circles in Grand Rapids and Chicago. But I think in the Peace Camp there was a kind of vibrancy to it. You know, we were always outside. I mean, just that living on the earth outside for a summer changes your body's energy and your spirit's energy. So there's a connection there that happens. And so I remember my experience of women's rituals before Peace Camp. There was a certain, like you'd create a design and you'd have a theme and you'd, you know, pull out a certain energy that you were trying to do, and you'd maybe raise a cone of power, and you know, so there was a certain form to it. Where at Peace Camp, you'd sort of start with a form, and then you'd kind of be in this wild dancing and chanting and raising energy space for a long, long time. So there was an aliveness to it. Plus there was a group, you know, the summer of '85, I would say on average there were 30 of us on the land all the time, and then you'd have people coming in at various times. But so that's an enormous amount of women to raise energy with, and we had that space that we would raise energy in. And as you mentioned, you know, Lindsay brought the fire walks, so we did those rituals together, which so there was just this like an ability to be in reality what you hope for. Like one of the things that I thought about, like I knew the goddess existed because we were experiencing liberation. Like there's that, like the goddess can't be manifest unless women are experiencing liberation. And that was an experience of liberation, not just an idea of liberation or a struggle for liberation. So that was an incredible part of it. I mean, it's very, like I find now in my life, you know, I don't have many places where you have that same level of bringing it, you know, raising the energy and making it real and bringing it right here.
Can you talk a little bit about doing the fire walks? Was that quite different from other stuff that was going on, or?
On some level it was the same, because it was in that circle, it was women raising energy together. What I remember about the fire walks is it was a relationship with our fear. And so there was a whole part of it that had to do with talking about our fears and calling those to mind, and then being able to let go of our fears as we let go of our fear of fire. And so we were creating a whole new relationship with fire. You know, probably all in all, it was only 3 or 4 times that summer that I remember there being a fire walk, maybe 4 or 5, you know, but it wasn't like a huge number of times, but it was an astonishing thing. I mean, I remember having the thought of, well, they're all walking across the fire, so I guess it's possible. And so then I just walked across the fire, you know, and then some women were dancing on the fire and not getting our feet burnt, you know. So it was bewildering. Afterwards, you know, I have this rational mind part. It's like, oh, maybe fire isn't really hot, you know, like maybe it just is possible to walk on fire, and we're all afraid of it, and we can't do it. And so then, when we're not afraid of it, we can do it. There was a technical part of it. You know, we built up a huge pile of logs, and then we set them on fire, and then we had a whole kind of ritual of chanting and dancing as the fire burned down, and then we raked them out into a long row of coals, so they were at the red coal stage. And I don't know, was it like 10 feet long, 12 feet long, 10 feet that we'd walk across, and then we'd kind of and we were singing and chanting and dancing the whole time. that we were walking. So, well, and that makes me think, Estelle, you did an anger ritual, and you set up a place in one of the barns and with sheets and kind of just to protect the space. And then we got all these sort of dishes that were like not needed, or we found at the junk yard, glass.
Right.
And then we would get to talk about the things that we were angry about and then throw them. Well, and it makes me think, Estelle, that part of the action of cutting the fence was a ritual magic action. Like there was this sense that why would we do this symbolic action when it wouldn't really stop them? But there was that sense of magically bringing our intention to cut down everything that they stood for. You know, cut down the killing, cut down the patriarchy, cut down hierarchies, cut down oppression. Another ritual to talk about is the rats. So there was a time when we had rats in the farmhouse, maybe one or two. You know, it wasn't a huge deal, but some women were very upset about it, and so of course we had a big meeting about it, and we didn't reach consensus. And some people wanted to poison the rats, and others didn't. And Laura Briggs, who did not identify as a witch, she identified herself as a very rational, justice-oriented Episcopalian. And she had a dream about the rats. And so somehow, based on her dream, we decided we should do a rat ritual, and we would build them a little house in the field. You know, just like a little house of straw and grasses, and we would put little seeds and food things that they would like. And then we did a ritual where we invited the rats to leave the house and come into the field and live in the field instead of living in the house. And so we were able to save the rats for a long time, well, for a short time. And then many of us left to go to Michigan, and they had another meeting. And all of those of us who were against poisoning the rats had gone. And so the women who were left poisoned the rats.
Right.
Or put out rat poison. This is one of the failures of consensus process.
Yes.
Or maybe on their view, maybe that's one of the successes. You know, but it was those kinds of questions. What's our relationship to animals? What's our relationship to rats even?
And the foods we were eating.
The foods we were eating. I don't remember if they were getting, I remember that we had that one room where we had all of the stored foods off the kitchen. And I don't think the rats were actually doing a great problem. I think that it was more a psychological problem for some of the women, that the rats were getting into the house. The Peace Camp was a very magical place, and one of the things that was magical, like women would come and go, so you never knew who would show up or, you know, who would leave. And so I was there during the winter. I had stopped off for a couple of weeks with Estelle in Rochester, and we found you a new apartment and got you moved. And then I went to the Peace Camp, and literally for a lot of that winter there were just 3 of us there. Myself and Sea Mist and Bissy. There was a point at which I was feeling pretty lonely, and I was wishing that I could go visit Laura. I didn't have a car there, didn't have money to speak of, and so I did a prayer. I remember it was winter, but I was outside. I had a snowsuit, I think, because I could go outside. Sometimes I'd go outside at night. There was always an aura of vulnerability at the camp, because you never, I mean, especially in '85, we had nighttime watchers. I don't remember if we had a name for what. Security. Because that's how I got to know you, Estelle. But in the winter, we didn't have security. It was just the 3 of us there. And so you did feel a little bit like sitting ducks sometimes if anybody wanted to be rowdy. But so sometimes I would just go outside, and I would actually feel safer just kind of sitting under a tree in the dark, because no one would know that I was there, and it was just very peaceful. But so I did a prayer, and in my prayer I was imagining a white, you know, like a knight on a white horse coming to carry me to Massachusetts. And the very next day, someone came in a white pickup truck heading to Massachusetts. And so I got a ride to go visit Laura. So but that feeling of like it was a crossroads. So women would come from everywhere, and so you could make a prayer like that, and it wasn't an impossibility, but it was pretty marvelous and magical that that actually happened. And it was the white pickup truck that, I mean, in my sense of the spirit, there's this little sense of humor that goes with these magical occurrences.
Can you say more about the security issues?
Sure. So summer of '85, we would have these various work shifts, and one of them was security, where you'd stay up all night around the fire, maybe 2 women at a time, maybe 3. But because the camp was not well received by the local people. There were some local people that were involved, but there were others who were quite hostile to what the camp was about. And then there would be helicopters going over from the base. We all had whistles in our tents so that in case anybody came on the land, we could whistle, and then other women would come. It was actually one of the things that happened to me being at the peace camp was that I got comfortable with being outside at night, because that was always something that I was afraid of, just as a woman and as a girl in our world. I was afraid to go outside at night. So, but being outside at the peace camp, you had this sense of, like, the whistle was a symbol of there were always your sisters who could come to your aid if you got into trouble. So, you know, security, the wonderful thing about it, it was one way to get alone with somebody, because one of the, like, you had all these lesbians around, but it was very hard to sort of court someone, because you're never alone, you're just always in these large groups, so you're kind of, I don't know, sexual attractions and connections and friendships were a little haphazard about how that could happen. But Estelle and I were on night duty once together, and that's how we became friends. Because you'd be sitting there around the campfire talking from dusk till dawn. And I can't remember if this was 85 or 86. It may have been 86 that I was doing the water, because I was there earlier. I think about that now with chemicals. You know, we had to put chlorine into the big tank, the huge black tank, and keep it at certain levels. And yeah, so we had all these different tasks to make it all function as a camp. And in that process of getting the camp ready for the summer, there were certain things that we had to do that related to code. That that may have, I don't know if that was the last summer that we actually did those kind of major, huge, you know, like keeping up with that water tank. And
Right, to get the camp
so
permit
we had
for
showers in
women.
the back
Yeah.
there, and hand washing stations and all of that.
What do you remember about how the camp survived financially in those summers that you were there, the winters that you were there?
I remember that we survived financially by donations. You know, I mean, there's 85 was like the big action. I mean, 83 was the big action year. You know, and I wasn't there in 84. 85, it was still a really viable community going on, and I think by 86, it was feeling a little like there was a lot of work for, I think that the average women on the land would have been more like 20 that year. And so, but I remember doing some fundraising letters. Like I remember putting together a sheet of paper with a lot of different quotes from women about what the peace camp meant to them, and sending it out to our mailing list. We did not have indoor plumbing, but we had a Xerox machine. It's a good activist, you know. And back then, of course, we didn't have computers back then. I mean, it was like, I remember Laura.
No cell phones.
Laura Briggs, you know, like was working on a computer at her school, and that was like my first introductions to computers were. So it was all mailings, mailing lists.
So if there were only 30 or so folks on the land, any average in 85 or 20 in 86, what was your sense of what the wider community was that supported the peace camp?
One of the things that was interesting to me, and this is again another comparison, I'd been part of the Catholic worker movement for 7 years before I came to the peace camp, and there were some similarities, which is that in the Catholic worker movement, people, they only survived if they had a network of support outside, and most of what people supported was our work with the homeless. But a lot of what we were doing was direct action and, peace witness. At the camp, I think the wider circle of support was mostly for the work that we were doing for peace. But the heart of what was going on there was this transformation of women's lives and lesbian community. So, but that wasn't, that my experience was that was not what people were sending money for, was that transformative experience for women. It was the actual work that we were doing related to peace and justice. So there was that same sort of little bit of a disconnect from what I experienced as most powerful about the peace camp and what people were actually willing to fund for us to do. So that's just my opinion about it.
You understood that at the time when you were living it?
Yeah, I think so.
Did you have methods to reconcile that, either internally or
Well, I think
externally?
fundraising wise, I think we focused on the work that we were doing for peace and justice. I mean, it's not like we were hiding that women's empowerment was going on, but it was just that wasn't the focus of the fundraising.
And do you remember any story between on-land women and off-land women and relationship back and forth, or power dynamics back and forth?
Not in an intense way. I mean, there were women, I remember specific groups of women. Like one fundraising thing I remember is a great affinity group of women from Bloomington that I later visited when I was in Chicago. And I came to visit them because they were doing a fundraiser there to send money to the peace camp. And so that was my experience of that kind of connection of women who come for a week to do action and then bring the message back to their home community, raise money and send it to the peace camp. I do remember a little bit that there was tension around money on camp because some women were there with nothing, or very limited resources without a lot of ways. I think I had done some personal fundraising to be able to come back to the camp, to be able to afford to stay there for a while. But, then there were local women who were working who could come in and out, and so that created, and then there was different class issues, so there were a lot of issues internally around what women had. And I think there came to be a clash between the sense of communities forming guidelines, and I think they were respected policies, right? That's what we called them?
Right.
Respected something.
Mm-hmm.
So a group of people achieves consensus about what will make it work for us to be on the land. And then other women coming in with what they would call an anarchist perspective, which I think probably in my life right now I'm a little bit cautious and critical of, in the sense that I think community is what saves us. And so if we don't have ways to negotiate community, how do we manage extreme individualism? So that balancing act between individual freedom and I can make choices to do whatever I want versus how do we come together as a community? And so I think we're really struggling with that, and both of those are important values. The fundamental issue was that the individuals involved didn't buy into the idea that we would even reach consensus as a group around an issue. And so that became, like, if you don't have some sort of foundational place that you're starting from, you can't make it work. And I know there was at least one situation where after 3 months of general meetings, we came to a decision to say that person couldn't be on the land. If people have a different memory of it, it seems like there were, we actually had monthly general meetings, and that took up 4 months of time, and that person was asked to leave the land. I could be wrong with that, and it might be a different incident, but I think that was actually the one where we just made the decision that if someone wasn't willing to be part of the process, then it didn't seem like it was a workable solution. Is that ringing any bells for people? Or?
Yeah, and I do remember that policy was based on the fact that there were Amish next door, that at various times they had religious services there, and that all the Amish from many areas were coming, and that there had been complaints of passing vehicles about nudity. And I do remember that the respective policy was that beyond the barn, you could take your shirts off, but up front you couldn't. And that the sheriff came by after he had received 13 telephone calls, and that happened consistently several times, and that the person was asked to stop doing it and refused.
The other thing is that men were allowed to come onto the front part of the land, and so there was a certain reticence among some of us to want to keep that sort of private space where we were distinctly women only.
Right.
And that also was behind the barn. Like,
right.
In fact, I think they only really kind of went up to the house, but that whole sort of front area was more open to the public. Yeah.
But I do remember a big part of that issue was that when we had been told that she was going to be arrested, and we told her, and it still didn't do any good, and that when the cops came on the land to arrest her, she ran. She ran to the back of the land, and they went after her, and then women were like furious because now
the
that space had been invaded, and that so I don't remember if, I know that after that we were much quicker to insist that people not be shirtless up front under any
and
circumstances.
there was always a bit of fluidity, like there was the day that it rained and the whole little backyard got all sopping wet and we had the naked soccer game. But it was at night, and we were, we weren't trying to flaunt nakedness. That wasn't maybe some people felt like that wasn't really the point of the camp, was to change nudity laws.
Right.
There was a freedom there that you could be nude, or I think there was also a freedom to just wear whatever and feel relaxed about it, so there was a different standard of beauty. There was a different standard of, we're getting dressed up for the wild dance party, which was that was a brand name even, right. I connect that name with Woody Blue. And I remember them being in the house. I don't know if we had them outside or not, and we would blast the music. It was always women's music, because there was a whole controversy about whether you could have boy voices, boy music is the little lingo. And so it was just us getting together and dancing for an hour, hours in the evening, and just, and so the lingo was the wild dance party. Well, one person I think about is Merry Christmas, who I was involved with for a brief while, and she was living in that area and working a working class job. I can't even remember now where she worked, but and she had a car, and so there was a funny dynamic where there would be women who came onto the land who had resources in other places, but didn't have particular resources then, and so people would often draw a lot on women like Merry Christmas, who had the car and had the local job, so had a little bit of an income, and so, but there was a tension in that too, because they had a kind of privilege that she maybe didn't have. Most of the women who came to the land were white women, but I'm thinking, one of the things I remember, another person I haven't mentioned is Joanna Cotty, but I remember her talking about when we would have these group discussions, and in her culture you'd always have a pause before the next person would speak. But in peace camp culture, a lot of times people would speak right away after someone spoke, and so it was very hard for her to insert herself because of that cultural dynamic. Or it seems to me that in that conversation it came out that in Jewish culture and African American culture, there's a kind of interruptive quality to the talking. And so, that conversation was about, well, how do you have a group process that makes room for all these different cultural dynamics in conversation? And, and if you have an interruptive culture, it's easier to jump in and be a part of it. But if your culture says, well, oh, you have to leave a pause. And if I'm remembering it correctly, I think at times we experimented with those different methods. Well, let's this time try to leave a pause before someone speaks, so that folks who are coming from cultures that do that have more room and don't get left out of the conversation. I count the Peace Camp as one of those transformative experiences in my life. And I think, for me, becoming a feminist, which I would identify as maybe 1979, is kind of waking up to, oh, right, there's a big problem. The Peace Camp was was like the big feeling of liberation after the feeling of, oh my God, we're so oppressed. And so it was profoundly transformative. I mean, there was just that you become, I came out as a lesbian, but for me it wasn't just, oh, I'm attracted to women. It was that sense of loving oneself as a woman and loving other women in a way that I wasn't like that before. Like there was an inner male directedness that was at the subconscious level that shifted, so that suddenly I could be a strong, assertive, powerful woman and love and support other strong, assertive, and powerful women. And I think it was also, there's a similarity to the idea of the Catholic worker, which is you're trying to create the world you hope for in a little pocket right in the midst of the world that is so oppressive. And so it was tremendously hopeful because you saw this vision of who we could be. Despite all the problems and all the issues, we were like a laboratory of, well, what can we create? And so, there was these times when it was miserable because we got stuck in a consensus process around or whatever. But you learned from that, and you say, okay, you have to think about structure, you have to think about boundaries and membership and responsibility and authority. It's like those fundamental questions. And so I carried that with me. I finished my Master of Divinity degree in the context of the Peace Camp. And so my thesis was about, incarnating the goddess and becoming, and that whole women's movement. And then I moved from the Peace Camp to Boston and did a kind of spiritual empowerment ministry with women, and did women's spirituality circles where I remember just that model, like there were two of us who knew anything about it and we gathered this group together. But the model in your head is teach every woman how to lead ritual, and so eventually everyone is sharing that circle. And I did feminist therapy, which again was also about empowering women and healing women, because we have so much that we carry. So there's that hopefulness. I think there's a sadness that I carry, which is a kind of nostalgia, because you have this, it's like Camelot, in the myths, you have this moment when you have 30 women making ritual, and I remember thinking when we went to the festivals, wow, like women get so excited to have this for a week, and we got to have it for a whole summer, and then the winter you still sort of have threads of it, and then summer again. So it was this living in our world, our new world, for a long time. But then when you're out, like so now in my work, it feels like there's this thread, because I'm still working for that world of equality and compassion and freedom. And now I'm doing it in a context that says we have to transform. Like it can't just be 300 women or 3,000 women. If we want to change the world, we have to change all the world. And so So I see a lot of the work that I'm doing now as making us a broad-based movement for change. And so I'm in a setting that's less radical, and yet those same values of, you know, what's possible. Like, I've been doing work for equal marriage here in Maine, and it's not because I want to get married. It's because it's about changing the definitions into a kind of partnership way of thinking. And, you know, it's about equality. So, and it's about, because it pisses the other side off, you know, because they know that it's like hitting at some of their core, you know, they don't often say it in the marriage arguments, but gay marriage isn't really a threat to most marriages, but it is a threat to the kind of marriage where the man is in power over the woman. Because if you have two women or two men, you can't do that. And so there's a kind of insidiousness to saying, oh yeah, we're gonna change this institution. You know, so that it feels like that's carried forward. And the nostalgia piece is, in the work that I'm doing now, it's very, there's a loneliness, you know, and I was saying earlier around dinner, but I'll repeat, I'm in a system that is hierarchically structured, and I can use that power. Audre Lorde said once, use what power you have to work for what you believe in. So I have this power of the office of ministry that I can use for social change, but yet it also creates a kind of exhaustion factor. And I remember sometimes, I remember Gail Walker saying, you know, that she would go out into the university, which was her work, and do that work, and then she'd come back to the peace camp for that recharging aspect of it. And, you know, so there's, and she compared it to being like yeast in bread, that all of us were like yeast in bread. So I remember that image, you know, that okay, I'm out there being yeast in bread, and every once in a while I have to find ways to get reconnected to the other yeasties, or start getting a little flat. You know, it's like, can't lift all this bread. Yeah, so that, you know, so that has stayed with me from there, you know, because it, when you face such large odds, it's nice to be able to imagine what we're fighting for and not just what we're fighting against. I was just at the Earth activist training that Starhawk does, and seeing some photos from various actions around the world against World Trade Organization and others, and they, you know, doing camps and doing permaculture gardening in the middle of whatever city they're in, and it was, and she framed it as when you're doing magic, you want to envision what you're hoping for, not what you're fighting against. And there was something, that was what the peace camp was like. You know, it was like reminding me, like it was all of us, we were creating the world that we were hoping for, not right in the shadow of the world we were fighting against. So it was very powerful magic to be doing that. And there's that thread that we keep doing, I keep doing in my life.